How you doing? So to start off today, I'm going to ask us a quick question. Have you ever felt like no matter where you are, you just don't quite fit in? Yeah. And not because people are unkind or they're ostracizing you or anything like that, but because the world itself seems just so out of step with your heart and with your values. That's the ache of being a spiritual exile. And before we dive in, though, let me just say this up front. Today's message is primarily for those of us who already follow Jesus. So if you're here today and you wouldn't call yourself a Jesus follower, first of all, I'm so glad you're here. I really am. Because today you get a front row seat to hear what God actually calls his people to do. But here's the good news. You're off the hook for today. You don't have to do a thing about what I'm about to talk about. So just listen in, no pressure. But make no mistake, Peter addresses early followers of Christ in 1 Peter chapter 2 as foreigners and exiles, citizens of heaven living in a land that isn't fully their home. And now today, we also live in a country that we love, with communities that we care about, but there's always a sense of being out of place and out of rhythm. And that can feel disorienting, doesn't it? Yeah. Because we belong to Christ, but we still live here in a world shaped by values and priorities that don't always line up with his. And that's also why questions of allegiance matter so much. Especially this week, as our community reflects on the Constitution, it's worth asking who or what really has my loyalty. Because for those of us who follow Jesus, our ultimate loyalty is not to a document, not to a flag, not to a party, not to a nation. It's to God's kingdom. Now, to be clear here, that doesn't mean rejecting our country. Don't ever think I was saying that. But it does mean viewing our country through the lens of God's love. Following him first shapes how we show up in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, and as citizens. But let's be honest, though. Living as spiritual exiles does create tension for us. The push and pull between engaging the world and protecting our hearts can tempt us towards one of two extreme directions just to survive. So the first extreme we're sometimes drawn to is withdrawal. Withdrawal is the idea that this country is a mess, this world is a mess, my community is a mess. I'm just going to retreat into my Christian bubble and wait for Jesus to return. Yeah. The other extreme, though, is assimilation. That's the idea of, I'm just going to go along with everything and everyone around me and just hope that I don't stick out. Yeah. Have you guys ever felt that tension? Felt that push and the pull? I know I have. But God, in Jeremiah chapter 29, gives us a third way. As spiritual exiles, we are not called to just survive. We are called to seek shalom. See, the Constitution famously calls us to promote the general welfare of our nation. And that is a noble and a necessary task. But God calls us as his followers to something even bigger, often harder, to seek shalom. Now, I'm going to be using that word a lot, so I want to define it for you. Because we hear the word shalom and we think, just peace. It just means peace. But it's not peace. It's true flourishing, harmony, and wholeness. Not just for ourselves, but for the communities around us. It's a calling that can put us at odds with culture, with politics, and even our own comfort, but it is the Lord's calling nonetheless. Now, quick confession before I dive into the actual passage I'm going to be preaching on. Most of us know Jeremiah chapter 29 from verse 11 in it, right? Yeah. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. I'm pretty sure that's the verse that's written in every single Christian high school graduation card, right? I'm pretty sure I have somewhere in my house a picture frame where my mom has that written on the picture frame that she gave to me when I graduated from college or something. Don't get me wrong, I do love that verse. But here's the truth, though. Jeremiah in chapter 29 is not writing to 18-year-olds deciding on their college major. anytime we're reading the Bible, anytime, we have to remember that the words written down were written to a specific people during a specific time and under specific circumstances. God was speaking to his exiled people in Babylon. He was not speaking to 21st century Americans and writing us a blank check for a perfect, pain-free future. All right? And yet, and this is so important, so I want you guys to hear me, even though we're not Israel and Babylon, there's still so much we can learn from Jeremiah chapter 29 about how God calls his people to live faithfully in a world that doesn't share their values. So that's what we're going to explore together today. So let's set the scene. When we arrive at Jeremiah 29, God's people, they're in crisis. The year is 597 BC, give or take. King Jehoiachin has surrendered Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon has now carried away much of Judah's cultural elite. You know, the artisans, the military leaders, the political figures, the priests, people like that. They're now in exile in Babylon. So these weren't just random captives. These were the people who had shaped society. But now they were hundreds of miles away from home, stripped of their power, their privilege, and their identity. And to understand exactly what's happening in Jeremiah 29, we have to back up to Jeremiah 28 as well. Because in Jeremiah 28, there's a spiritual conflict brewing. Because there was a prophet named Hananiah who stands up and declares, "Don't worry, everyone, don't worry. Exile is only going to be for 2 years. God's going to bring us back home in just 2 more years." It sounded comforting. It sounded hopeful even, but it was a lie. And God struck Hananiah dead for leading his people astray. One of the many reasons why you should not be a false prophet, okay? But now, in this disorienting moment, God now sends a letter to his exiled people through Jeremiah. That is chapter 29. It's a letter from God. But here's the twist, though. It was not a letter of rescue, but it was a letter of reorientation. Shockingly, God tells his people, it's not going to be 2 years. It's going to be 70 years. You're not going home anytime soon. And for the exiles, that news was devastating. 70 years meant whole lifetimes, entire generations that were going to be born, growing up, and then dying in Babylon. This was not going to be a short detour. This was going to be their new reality. And yet, in the middle of this heartbreak, God gives them a word of hope and some tasks. So read with me in Jeremiah 29, verses 4 through 7. It's in the bulletin. "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." This is not what any of the Israelites were expecting. I need you guys to understand that. Because if you were an Israelite in Babylon, you were praying that God was going to come and defeat your enemy and bring you home. Everything in their hearts in this moment wanted to resist, revolt, and resent Babylon. But God says, settle in. Build houses. Plant gardens. Get married, raise kids, live your lives. Seek the peace and prosperity of Babylon, because if Babylon prospers, you will also prosper. Don't just survive, seek shalom. So let's unpack this. Verse 5 basically is God telling them, let's settle in for the long haul. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. You see, these are long-term activities. You don't build a house or plant a garden if you're planning on leaving in 2 years. God is telling them through this verse, accept reality. Stop waiting for an escape and start building your life where you are right now. And verse 6 picks this up again. He's telling them to think generationally. Marry and have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. God isn't telling them just to survive and wait this out. He's calling them to thrive across generations. Keep your identity. Raise your children faithfully in a foreign land. But then verse 7. That's the most shocking. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. Because if it prospers, you too will prosper. You see, for centuries, God's people have prayed for Jerusalem's peace, as he has commanded them to do. But now he tells them to pray for Babylon. 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 It's Babylon. Like, Babylon was their enemy. That's crazy. Babylon was the city that had destroyed their temple, burned their homes, humiliated their king, and then brought them into exile. But in Hebrew, though, it literally reads, for in her shalom is your shalom. To be clear here, God isn't telling the Israelites here, assimilate. But he also isn't saying rebel or revolt. He's giving them a third way. He's saying, live faithfully. Work for the good of the city. Trust my timing. It's the exact opposite of the false prophet Hananiah. God is saying, find blessing in the midst of exile and be a light in the land that feels dark to you. He's telling his people, don't live out the next 70 years as agitators or complainers or people just trying to survive. Don't sulk or rage or just wait for an escape. Instead, even here in exile, I am with you. I have placed you here for a purpose. Don't just survive. Seek shalom. And this idea, it wasn't just for ancient Israel. Because Jeremiah's words point forward to a bigger story, a theological reality that the New Testament then takes up. And I said this at the start. We too are exiles. And the Apostle Peter, writing in 1 Peter chapter 2, says, dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires, live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. So just like Israel and Babylon, we live in a time that the theologians call the already but the not yet. Some of you guys have maybe heard that before. It's the idea that the kingdom of God has already come in the person of Jesus, but its fullness is not yet here. We're waiting for restoration, but while we wait, God calls us not just to survive, but to seek shalom, to build, to plant, to pray, to bless. So just as he called the Israelite, God calls us to live faithfully in this in-between. Not to retreat, not to isolate into our Christian churches or in communities where everybody looks like us and acts like us and believes what we believe. God calls us to engage, praying for our cities and nations and seeking the shalom of the places where he has sent us, even when they don't feel like home. Probably especially when they don't feel like home. This is the heartbeat of verses 4 through 7. This is God's invitation to the Israelites and to us. Don't just survive, seek shalom. Even when you don't agree with everyone around you. And make no mistake, Jeremiah chapter 29, it's not about political strategy. It's about shaping hearts. God wasn't just giving Israel a survival plan for Babylon. He was using his time to form them spiritually. To paraphrase one scholar, exile teaches us to live as a peculiar people, marked by love, humility, and hope in the midst of kingdoms that are not our own. So this is not passive waiting. This was active flourishing. It's a call to be a redemptive presence wherever God has placed us as his people. And the ultimate example of what this looks like can actually be found in one of the heroes of the Bible from this very period of exile. Daniel. Yeah, seeing some nods. Daniel was just a teenager when he was pulled into captivity, Ripped from his home, his family, and everything familiar, he and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were basically put into a Babylonian re-education program. Because let's be honest, that's exactly what it was. The empire tried to erase their Jewish identity. They gave them Babylonian names. They taught them the language and the literature of the empire, and even offered them food from the king's table that violated God's law. Now, Daniel, in that moment, famously resolved in his heart that he would not defile himself, and he only ate vegetables and drank water for 10 days, which, fun fact, is actually one of my mom's favorite stories in the Bible because she's a vegetarian. So, yeah, you vegetarians can take that one and put that one in your back pocket. But the point I'm trying to make is that despite the circumstances he was in, Daniel stayed committed to his faith, but he didn't withdraw from Babylonian society. He learned their language. He served in the king's court. He became a top advisor to both Nebuchadnezzar and then later Darius. He sought the good of the city, exactly as Jeremiah 29 commands. But when his faith was tested, he also drew a clear line. I already talked about the food, but we also know from Daniel 6, every kid's favorite Bible story. When King Darius signed a law forbidding anyone to pray to anyone but him, Daniel continued praying to the Lord 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, just as he has always done. And that act of faith landed him in a lion's den. But God delivered him. Here's the key. Here's what I want you guys to take away. Daniel shows us what it looks like to engage without assimilating. He fully participated in the life of Babylon, but he never lost his ultimate allegiance to God. He didn't isolate himself into a holy huddle of only other Israelites, but he also didn't compromise to blend in. He worked for the flourishing of Babylon, but he worshiped the Lord alone. See, Daniel's life is a living illustration of what Jeremiah 29 calls us to do. He didn't just survive in Babylon, he sought Shalom. He brought peace, wisdom, and blessing to a pagan empire, but he also kept his identity rooted in God's covenantal promises. Now, centuries later, early Christians would embody this exact same principle. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, waves of plague, likely smallpox or measles, swept through the Roman Empire, and these epidemics would kill up to 1/3 of entire cities. You guys imagine that? 1/3 of your entire city dead from a plague? Must have been horrible. And as sickness would spread, panic would set in. Pagans fled the urban centers, leaving behind the sick, the elderly, and even their own family members. But Christians responded differently. Remembering Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself and embodying Jeremiah 29 without even probably having it in front of them, they sought the shalom of their cities. Even though they were cultural outsiders, even though they were often mocked, marginalized, or persecuted, they didn't retreat, and they stepped into the brokenness. So Dionysius, a bishop in Alexandria during one outbreak, wrote, "Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attended to their every need, and ministering to them in Christ." So while the rest of society abandoned the dying, Christians stayed. They cared for strangers, even those who didn't share their faith, risking their own lives. And the result of this was remarkable. Many modern historians now believe that one reason why Christianity spread so rapidly in its early centuries was because believers responded to crisis differently than the surrounding culture. Their sacrificial love drew people in. And the pagans began to wonder, who are these people who are risking their lives to care for us when no one else will? You see, the church grew because Christians took the words of Jesus and took Jeremiah 29 seriously. They didn't try to escape the city. They didn't assimilate to the culture. They didn't just survive the chaos. They sought shalom right in the middle of it. But let's be honest. It's okay, we're all friends here. Seeking shalom, it isn't natural. It's hard. Everything in us wants to either withdraw and protect ourselves or assimilate and blend in. Yet God calls us to this messy middle, to love people who may never love us back, and to work for the good of the places that might reject us. And if Daniel could seek shalom in Babylon, and the early church could seek shalom in ancient Rome, surely we also can seek shalom in our communities and in our nation. We have no excuses. And we should do this no matter which political party is in power or no matter how unstable life feels in any given moment. So what does this look like for us today? Might look different for each and every one of us. Maybe for you at work, it means instead of retreating from people who see the world differently, it means you listen to them, you serve them, you build trust. Maybe in your neighborhood, it means that even if the person across the street is driving you insane for some reason, you choose to love them anyway. You choose to bring peace and reconciliation where there's tension. And in your city or your county or your town, when you see brokenness in schools, in politics, or relationships, maybe it means you don't retreat into cynicism, but instead you pray, you volunteer, you show up. When you see a need, you fill it. And in our country, even when national divisions seem overwhelming, which, let's be honest, right now they do, seek the good of your neighbors, pray for leaders, and work for the flourishing of your community. Not for power or for gain, but for the peace and the shalom that God desires. And let me be clear here again. We are not called to wait for the right leaders or for life to feel stable. Life did not feel stable for Daniel in Babylon. Life did not feel stable for the Christians in the 2nd and 3rd AD, centuries AD. Life was hard, it was unstable, the right leaders were not in place. God's people seek shalom right here, right now, in this Babylon for his glory. As followers of Jesus, we don't just survive, we seek shalom. And friends, this also isn't about us as individuals. It's about us as God's people. It's about us as the global church. So Pastor Brian preached on Matthew 5 just a few weeks ago. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Let your light shine before others so that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. What if our churches became known as communities of people who bring peace where there's division, hope where there's despair, love where there's fear? Yeah. What if we were the first to serve, the first to forgive, the first to engage, especially those who disagree with us? Because when the church lives this out, our cities flourish and we also flourish. So I've said it again and again and again today. Don't just survive. Seek shalom. So here's your challenge for this week. First, I want you to identify one Babylon in your life, a place where you feel like an exile. Could be your workplace, could be your neighborhood, could even be your family. And second, I want you to ask God, I want you to ask him, show me one practical way to seek shalom there this week. Maybe it's just praying for someone, as God commands in verse 7. Maybe it's seeking reconciliation with someone you're in disagreement with. It could be anything. But I want you to ask God, how can I bring shalom, flourishing, peace in this moment or in this relationship? And then third, do it. Do what God tells you to do. And not just for your own comfort, but for the good of your neighbor and for the glory of God. See, when we stop simply trying to survive and instead seek shalom in our communities, the gospel bursts forth into the world. Not in grand gestures, but in simple, unwavering, but radical acts of kindness and love. Let's pray. Father,